I'm Nathan Van Geem. I work at Wildcard Corp. I've been doing Plone for 5 years, and we have a lot of experience in deploying Plone in very secure scenarios where we have a lot of requirements for Plone to be very secure. This talk is geared towards anybody using Plone, anybody editing content in Plone, integrating Plone, deploying Plone. So I hope there's a little bit for everybody. And I am a programmer. I'm a nerd. I'm not a good speaker, so those first two presentations, don't expect to be anywhere near as good as them. Either way. You still have high expectations? Be prepared to be disappointed then, I guess. So I'm going to go through how Plone security works, how permissions, roles, and sharing and workflows kind of work, and like how you kind of just some basics of programming for setting permissions on views and checking permissions, and then some deployment strategies. So Plone has a very good security model. It's like you can be very granular and specific to certain content has different permissions than other content, and you can really split out how certain users are allowed to use the system in different areas. And it accomplishes it with workflows, but with permissions and different roles and stuff, security. But and all of Plone's input is validated. Plone doesn't use a SQL database, so you don't have to worry about SQL injection, which is nice. And it has an excellent track record of not very many CVEs, especially compared to some of the other MySQL, PHP, like CMSs, worse code, and SQL injections. You can kind of have a lot of CVEs. So how the security model works is permissions are assigned. Permissions define access to content and possible actions that can be performed on that content. And permissions are granted to certain roles, and then roles are assigned to groups of users or just specifically to users. So it's kind of like this nice pretty graph to help you visualize when you're setting up your site how these permissions are going to be kind of distributed. And they're always kind of assigned by roles, or you assign roles to groups. And some of the pre-baked roles that come with Plone are contributor, which allows you to add content. An editor, you can edit content. And reviewer, you can publish content that a contributor made. And this is I'm describing how the default workflow that Plone ships with, how those roles perform in that default workflow. And then site admins can kind of have access to everything, but then they don't get access to the ZMI, and then the regular managers can kind of do whatever they want. And so when you're setting up your site, try to, a mistake a lot of people do is just give everybody admin or something, but try to assign roles properly across your site, so you don't have to worry about someone doing something in site setup or the ZMI and totally screwing up your site. And okay, so if you're not familiar with the ZMI, just so I stop throwing around acronyms that people might not be familiar with too much, it's like this management interface for doing some kind of lower level things on the framework of Plone. The default groups that are shipped with Plone are administrators, reviewers, and site administrators. So those kind of maps somewhat with the roles that we talked about. And all of these, creating groups is easy, and creating new roles is easy. So you can do this. You can kind of structure and prepare your site for how you want to deploy it. And then another really nice feature of Plone is you can kind of assign these roles on a particular section of a site. So you can create a folder that maybe you want everybody in a certain group to have full access to. So you just share that group in that folder and give them access to it. And really what all that sharing tab is doing is kind of applying local roles to users, so just roles that are specific to that part of the site. It's really powerful. Lots of people do it. And we'll kind of get into more how workflows can be used in that sense too, on a separate part of the site too. And how workflows work, at least in the Plone sense, they're composed of states and transitions. A state basically maps permissions to roles, and then a transition transfers the content from one state to another. And so certain actions can be performed on transitions programmatically, and like with content rules, you can send emails and do whatever. So every single time you transfer to the new state, that new mapping of permissions to roles is kind of overwritten. And so that's kind of how the permissions kind of get transformed from state to state. And then the available workflows that come shipped with Plone, the one that is the default is the simple publication workflow. And that's where you have contributors, editors, and things are private by default. And the idea is could have them reviewed if necessary and then published. And then a community workflow is, I think it was the older Plone workflow. I'm not exactly positive, but that is where things are published by default. And they still have some of the features of the simple publication workflow, but a little bit more, just less review. And then intranet, extranet, that's self-explanatory. You're kind of like required to, just works like an intranet. People who are part of the site have access. Single state, it's not really necessary to go into, but if you don't care that anything is private or anything ever, you just want to publish everything on the site, you could do something like that. And then roles, and every single one of these workflows, the roles kind of work differently because the workflow defines how the roles behave in each state. So sometimes people get confused on that, like, well, it's called contributor or whatever, or editor. Well, it kind of depends on how that role is set up to use that workflow. It could be that the workflow doesn't actually modify a permission that you're expecting it to do, or that it's just doing it differently than what you'd hope. But these things are all editable through the web, and it's one very nice thing about Plone is all the permissions and everything you can really customize through the web, and you have a lot of control. So you can also set workflows on. You can set a default workflow for your whole site, which is what Plone does by default. Or you can set different workflows for different types of objects. And can be pretty powerful because then you can potentially just copy a content type and have this variant of a content type have a different workflow. Or if you're making workflow apps like Oshkosh does, you can kind of assign your own custom content types, their own custom workflow, so it kind of works and behaves and has different transitions and states than other objects on the site. And so there's also this concept in Plone of placeful workflows, and how I was saying how with the sharing tab you can kind of share content differently in a certain section of a site. Well, with workflows you can have a completely different workflow just on a section of the site. And that can also be really powerful if you want to have like an intranet folder or just something different, something custom on a different part of the site. It's pretty powerful. This is just a demonstration of how you use it. I'm sorry, I forgot. So yeah, to enable it though, you have to go to Add Remove Products in the site setup and find the workflow policy support package and activate it. It's not activated by default. And then you go to the state dropdown on a folder that you want to modify, and you edit the policy. And then you can kind of specify if it's meant for everything below the folder or for that folder. And there's like there's a few prepackaged ones that you can select. There's a management of those in the site setup for workflow policies. And so customizing workflows, if you, by default Plone, you can just kind of go in the ZMI, append, that wonderful URL onto the site root, and you can kind of see the actual definitions of the workflows, and you can inspect them and see what they do and how they're wired up and what permissions are assigned where. Every workflow only manages a certain amount of permissions. Plone probably ships with hundreds of permissions for various things, but there's like a core set of permissions that workflows generally only modify, and you can add more if you want to kind of customize how permissions are done, or you can work with those. And if you want to manage all the workflows in a kind of nicer way where it's they're kind of all together and you don't have to go from screen to screen as much, there's an application called Plone App Workflow Manager that when I was at the university, it kind of helped start develop. It's really nice, makes it really easy. You can create new ones very simply, and it'll kind of clone existing workflows to base your new workflows on, and you can assign the types. You can get a state, a workflow diagram of it. It's pretty handy. One other thing I would like to note about if you're going to modify workflows, it will not apply to existing content immediately. So say you change how a workflow is working, existing content will still have their old security definitions. There's a, I don't know if I missed it or not, and I must not have had it. There's a, in the portal workflow management in the ZMI, there's a button to update security settings, and that will go through all the objects on your site and update them with the updates to the workflow. And so if you want to modify non-workflow related permissions, like permissions that aren't modified via workflow actions, you can just go into Plone site /manage_access. You can see the whole list of them, but be careful, because you can screw up things if you don't know what you're doing. So for developers, I'm just going to go through some basics of which permissions are you going to most often use, how to define them, how to use them in views, and how to use CSRF protection. So these are the most common, at least I think, they're the most common permissions that we use. And so if you have permission to modify content on the site, you'll have, or a piece of content in that, you'll have modified portal content permission. And there's if you have permission to view, you'll have zope2.view permission, and add content and manage portal, so on. And it's simply, this is just copied from somewhere in Plone. You simply say permission equals cmf.review portal content, or add portal content at the bottom there, whatever, and it's just part of your CCML definition or wiring for your view. And then if you want to define your own permission, it's just it's just this, and make sure you define your permission before you use it, otherwise you get errors in startup. And this is kind of how if you want to check for a different permission in some code, you can use Security Manager and just do check permission with whatever permission you want to check. And most of those permissions are listed in products.cmf core, but I didn't test myself, but I'm pretty sure it just accepts a string value for checking that permission. And so CSRF. So in case you don't know what CSRF protection is, it's basically ensuring that whoever is submitting a form actually clicked the button to submit it, that they weren't presented a form from some other place and said, hey, click this button to do something, and instead it actually performs some kind of malicious action on a different site that they know they have access to. So all you do is inside your form, you do this little HTML snippet, and then you, in your view, on your handling of that request, you just make sure you check to verify that they indeed came from the correct site. And some detailed docs is on the developer.plone.org. It's very good. Should cover most of what you need. The collective docs are getting pretty good. Okay, so now I'm going to go through like secure deployment strategies and integration strategies. So a lot of what this is going to entail is a more robust security framework if you need to be more careful, or if you just feel like being extra safe with your Plone site. Some of it might not be applicable, but it's good to think about some of these different things that you can do to protect yourself. And so I'll go through like having a separate editing backend from the front end, and like sanitizing your site, and like kind of blocking things with your web server, and doing like read-only Plone clients for anonymous users. But the obvious things you can do first are make sure you patch your software. Make sure you're subscribing to the mailing lists or the XML feeds of the software that you're using in production, so you know when there's a vulnerability and you can patch it right away and that you're prepared. Assign privileges correctly to all your users, and a build-out tip or deployment tip is always run build-out. Like, don't run build-out with sudo, because that's like downloading packages from the internet. And yeah. Oh, I think the latest build-out does this by default, right? The latest production. Steve, can you comment on that?
Well, if you're installing via the unified installer and you try to run build out as root, it will declare an error saying you're trying to root your computer to the internet.
Yeah, so like the proper way is to have like a build-out user that has permission to kind of manage the build-out, and then another Plone user to actually run the Plone site. And you kind of have to be careful with it, because occasionally the Plone user won't have permission to like generate the language translations. So then like you could get a bunch of like warnings in your startup because like all these languages weren't able to get compiled. But there's a precompiler.
It compiles all the PYC files and the language files.
Perfect. So another thing you can do is have a separate editing backend where your front end will be read-only, and your editing backend will be protected by another kind of authentication scheme on top of Plone, just so they don't have access directly at Plone that can write to the database. And you can do like RSA, which can be expensive, and Wicked, which I don't think is that expensive, but Wildcard produced a nice WSGI or proxy application that's open source, and we use it, and it works really well for doing two-factor authentication. It works with, you can set it up with like a Google Authenticator, or you can just do email authentication to send a PIN. It works really nice. And just make sure you use different DNS for the different backends, so people can't figure out where your editing backend is from your front end. So for read-only, to do read-only, you can have ZIO replicate, a read-write database replicate to a read-only ZIO. So that assures even if like an account is exploited and someone gets into your public site, that their writes won't ever do anything. And as long as they can't get past your two-factor auth or don't even know where your real backend is, they won't be able to do anything to affect your site. And so for replication, pretty much the two ways to do it is ZRS or rel storage. And ZRS used to cost like a lot of money, but they just open sourced it less than a month ago. And it's really good software. We've used it. And I would suggest if you need any kind of replication of, it's really nice. And it does complete transactions. So you won't have a case where like if you're doing rel storage, which kind of tries to do replication with a relational database, you could have something that wasn't quite replicated yet, but still kind of showing up. This will do complete transactions, so that won't happen. And what else am I trying to say? Oh, so it does blobs, right? And with rel storage, there's no easy way to handle blobs. You either have to do like an NFS, which isn't actually a replicated version of it, or you have to store the blobs in the relational database, which can be really slow. And ZRS actually does everything, and it's very nice.
When did they open source ZRS?
Just like less than a month ago. So this is just some kind of build-out tips to set up read-only, and we'll go into ZRS also. This is kind of like the latest build-out. I just released it, so if you want to do it, make sure you get the latest. And so this is just read-only build-out option for the Plone recipe Zio server. And if you want, you can kind of just stick it in your Zio config, but that's going to be rewritten every single time you run build-out, so it's kind of annoying. Pretty much the same thing with the Zio client. And that's just what it's going to write out. And so you can edit the ZOP config specifically if you don't have the newer recipe. And this is if it's just an instance and not a Zio client. That's not what you'd be doing in production anyways. I hope not. So read-only, so there was no, like I said, there's no option to do read-only with the recipe prior to just a few days ago. You'd have to do something with, like I created a package called like wildcard.insert into, so you could like insert configuration into other files, but I just finally fixed the recipe. And yeah, so I kind of warned you about this stuff already. Never mind. So the drawback to straight up read-only is you can get really ugly like read-only error messages. So Plone only generates image scales on demand. So if your front end didn't request, or I'm sorry, if your back end didn't request an image scale, and that scale never got created, then your front end wouldn't have that, and when it tried to create it, it would throw an error saying, hey, this is read-only, I can't write to the database here. Wouldn't happen very often, but it will. It will happen sometimes. But there's like, there's a solution for it. There's a wildcard that read-only that will prevent all those errors from being thrown. And so it won't write to the database, but at least allow the request to finish so it can be served. So as long as you're caching it, so say it's an image scale case, as long as you're caching that image scale, it's not going to be a performance hit very much, and you won't get errors. And so one thing you really have to be careful about with this then is it does it by aborting all transactions, which also means that some emails might not get sent out, because if the transaction's aborted, a framework says, well, I don't want, like, we wrap our email sending in a transaction, so it all sends it at the end of a request. And so those will be aborted. There's an additional read-only, like only just abort a transaction if it detects that there are like objects that are going to be trying to be written to the database. And so that should prevent those edge cases, and then also allow emails to be sent out without problem. So if you still want to have a front end read-write, but you still want to kind of provide some extra protection, you can have different ZIO clients be read-only, and you can kind of direct certain requests to certain ZIO clients. You can, and that's kind of complicated, but it's an option. You can mix read-write and read-only ZIO clients. And you can use this product called wildcard.lockdown, and that kind of allows you to conditionally abort transactions or to conditionally have your site read-only. So on certain requests or in certain sections of the site, say you want to be able to have a read-write database, then you can do it there. And you kind of have to create the rules, but you can do it. Or you can say on certain domains you want it to be read-write. So this is kind of like a simpler solution, but you have to create rules programmatically, which you have to have a little bit of programming skill, I guess. But they're not too hard, right? That's not hard. And these are just some of the settings. Kind of running out of time here, so get going here. So this is for setting up ZRS now. So if you want to do replication, it's pretty easy. It's just a couple of lines in build out now, as long as you got the latest ZIO server recipe. And it's basically all you're doing is specifying the recipe with the ZRS in brackets to say, hey, I want that ZRS feature, and it'll download the extra packages for you. And then doing the replicate too for where you want to have it running the replication server. And then the read-only, the secondary server, is just going to say replicate from. So it's the same addresses that you were using on the replicate to. And these other settings are just to make sure if you're going to do it in the same config to test, to make sure you specify different blob file storage and everything so you can see how it's replicating. So ZRS, secondary has to be read-only. If you do not and a transaction gets written to your secondary, it will put it out of line with the primary, and it will no longer replicate. So it must be read-only. And ZRS, you can chain replicate these. So a secondary can replicate from another secondary, so you don't have that master replicating to 10 different ZIO servers. You kind of spread the load out. So switching gears a little bit, to protect your site, you also want to make sure you're kind of protecting the information that's being disseminated from the site. Many sites probably don't. They probably want author information to be presented, but some sites probably might not. So make sure your RSS feeds don't have who the author was on it. Make sure your servers aren't giving out headers that tell people inspecting the sites more about it than that's necessary. Yeah, and so Office documents and PDF documents, this is a mistake that if you have this case where you don't want to disseminate this information, we've made this mistake before, or just not even thought about it. Is people will make these, and then Office and Word will write information as metadata to these documents, and people can download them and find out, oh, this was actually written by this person who has this email, this workstation. Not good. There's no really good solution for that, because there's no package out there that will actually be able to write or sanitize all types of documents metadata. All you can do is there's stuff that will be able to read most documents. So what we've done is just kind of monitor all documents being uploaded, and if there was something in it that if it detected some metadata, it would error. But then they would have to clean that out themselves. It's not ideal, but until something can clean that or modify all types of documents, that's kind of all you can do. And make sure you're monitoring your site, make sure you're seeing who's poking around, Make sure you're watching your processes and restarting them if they're consuming too much RAM. And doing like pingdom just to see, like make sure the site's up in all parts of the world. Kind of saying, yeah, we have, on some of our sites, we have just email alerts that'll come to us if there's like suspicious activity, if some user's requesting a lot of uncached resources, we'll get email alerts to see what's happening, or if they're doing a lot of or if they're producing a lot of 404s or 500s, which shouldn't happen though either, then we'll know and block them accordingly. So some of the things you can just block by default if this is a public site that they aren't going to be that you don't want people logging into your front end. You can just block anything managed underscore, anything login, anything ACL users. You can block all request types except for GET, or do you even need POST? If not, that's a big bonus because then you can like cache everything and you can only allow head and GET requests. Some sample Nginx blocks for blocking or scrubbing headers and blocking. Caching, make sure you use a caching server to kind of protect your Plone backends, and make sure you optimize your caching, remove any unnecessary query parameters. There's kind of add-ons for Varnish, and I don't know about ATS, but maybe that will sort your query parameters so you're not duplicating cache. And if you take hashes off, if someone has anchor links with hashtag links, those could be separate hits to your caching proxy every single time. If you strip those before, you don't get another hit to Plone, and you can kind of keep Plone only doing what it needs to and having a good cache built up. Oh, sorry, I was talking about some of this stuff. So you can also set up Varnish to be able to serve stale requests, and by stale requests I mean, so by stale I mean cache that's supposed to be expired. You can set it up to do that even when your backends are down. I'm sorry, I'm running out of time here, so let's try to finish this off. Make sure you do not overload Plone. If you have to pool the requests at proxy level until it gets to Plone, know what Plone can handle. You can use CDNs if you have the money. That's awesome, but most people don't. Use Cloudflare if you don't. It's free for the basic service, and it's really nice. You can turn on basic caching, and even if you don't use any of the features, just like the DNS management is really nice. Everybody should use Cloudflare. Most people should use Cloudflare. Some other blocking, you can do like web application firewalls for blocking known bad attacks, and there's like mod security, and now there's mod security for Nginx also. There's some solutions for that, and I think that's mostly it. There's a reference to some resources, and thank you for listening, and let's try to get some questions in. We don't have much time, so anybody questions? You want to go up to the mic?
Actually, I can say it real loud. I think everybody heard me.
Sure.
Will the slides be available?
Yes.
Okay.
Anything else, guys?
Question about seal replicated. Does it play nicely with distributed file storage? Because I have an infrastructure where I have a file storage and a blob storage per site that I'm using.
Yeah, you'll have to, like that configuration probably won't help you. You'll have to set it up for every single instance that you, if you have a different Zio server running, you'll have to set it up for each one. But yeah, it'll work. Yep.
What about if people contribute to a site and I happen to not know those people? So is that pretty much a situation that they upload a picture, they upload stuff, and they can like do anything? Or what's security looking like there? If I allow those people to, or people with an ID to
So
contribute content?
so they'll have like an ID to your site, so it's like maybe, okay. It depends on how you set it up. You can have members be able to add content. Members are an actual role that I guess I didn't cover. I apologize for that. So you can have them have certain access if you want, but it's really up to you how you set it up. You can have them not be able to do anything but view content that they wouldn't otherwise be able to if they weren't logged in.
No, but I understand that I can lock down everything, but what are the implications if I want to give some people the right to put up a page, on that page, create a page, edit the page, and even put up a picture there? Is that pretty much where I'm like, all bets are off? Or
Well, I mean, no. I mean, like the input's still validated. Like by default, Plone ships with like heavy HTML sanitization where you can't even like insert certain tags, and it kind of annoys people. But that's for like security reasons. If you have people who you don't totally trust, they're only allowed to do certain kind of HTML. But you can be. I don't think it's not something you need to be worried about. I mean, this is what people do. They can create their pages, and they don't have to have access to anything else. And I don't think there's necessary security worries that you'll have unless you have some kind of site that you need to be very careful of who you allow access to or anything. Does anybody have any comments? Because we all have sites that.
I'll just say, you know, you pick where you want to be on the security spectrum.
Yeah.
You evaluate the risks that you've got, and if your situation is a relatively low risk situation, you know, you're not going to the extremes that Nathan was talking about. You would want to be.
Yeah, I hope I didn't scare anybody, right?
I mean, there's a large cost at the high levels of security you set. We're going to have to have special multi-factor logins and special URL strategy. Only if your risk level's high you can do that.
Yeah, we're talking about like agencies, government agencies. So.
But it's great to learn how it's done.
So.
So is there a set of an instruction set out there that if I just want to run a quote normal Plone site, which of course doesn't exist, but where I can say, okay, so do this, don't do this, use this.
Sure. There's a user manual on plone.org that's good. I think there's a free user manual that Enfold is going to be providing to everybody at this conference, and that's probably a good start. Does anybody have any comments on that too?
Fairly new document on developer.plone.org. We have a hosting document that is just all about the basic considerations of how you set up a host. And it gets the lower levels of the security that Nathan's talking about without going to the extreme.
Dinesh?
About your workflows, if you customize a workflow,
Yes.
do you have any actually suggestions or actually what are the concerns while customizing a workflow for our site?
The concerns are if you don't do it properly, you can have someone having access to something that you wouldn't otherwise want them to. You have to test them, and yeah, you have to be careful. That's
So I'm talking about suppose a DC workflow.
DC workflow? Yeah.
You use and customize the
You're customizing that product specifically. That's something I haven't done. I normally have found it to do everything that I've needed to do. How are you customizing it? You mean like more so than the default?
Permissions will be defined in separate files and we can install as a new product.
Okay, well, that's not necessarily customizing. That's like what DC workflow provides, right? Yeah, I mean, there's no security problems besides just knowing what you're doing as far as distributing access and keeping, assigning the right permissions, I guess, basically. It's just kind of on the integrator to know that they want these users to do these certain things. I hope that answers your question. Sure.
Quick question.
ZRS, so essentially set up two separate zero instances
Yes.
that are running?
Yes.
So then, how do you failover? Does it handle failover on its own, or do you have to?
No, you'd have to set that up yourself with like HA proxy or something. But yeah, they don't do failover on your own.
Can the slave become a master without restarting?
No, that's a drawback. And I've talked to Jim Fulton about it, and he's got some ideas of how you can handle that better. But yeah, that's a drawback. Sure.
I just had a question about Terraform. So when you talk about having a read-only site and a writable site, would that mean that your read-only site would be mysite.com, and then you would have like content.mysite.com that would be where people would be able to add content?
Sure. Yeah, it can be any different URL. Completely different URLs to access the read-write site to the read-only site. Any other questions? Yep.
You mentioned that setting TTL values, right? When you serve cache.
Yes.
How we can set actually the TTL?
That's a varnish. Like you can override TTL values in varnish. I didn't give you. There's an example on that on my website that I linked to on how to do like high availability varnish configuration that you can look for manually setting a TTL value. Anything else? Guys ready for lunch? Thanks.